Every farmer in Harden County, Iowa, had a place where he put things that were too broken to fix and too heavy to haul away. A fence corner, a tree line, the back of the barn where the weeds grew high enough to hide what was there. It's one of the quiet embarrassments of farming, the accumulation of failure. A plow blade that cracked, a hydraulic cylinder that blew, an engine block that seized because someone forgot to check the oil on the wrong day. These things don't disappear when they stop working. They sit where they die, rusting slowly, sinking into the ground, becoming part of the landscape like tombstones for machines that gave everything they had. Most farmers hated looking at their dead equipment. It reminded them of bad seasons, bad luck, bad decisions. So they pushed it out of sight, or they hauled it to a ravine, or they called the scrap man who came through twice a year with a flatbed and paid $8 a ton for anything made of iron. But there was one farmer in Harden County who didn't hate his dead equipment. He loved it. He collected it. He cataloged it. He organized it with a precision that would have impressed a librarian. And for 20 years, everybody laughed at him for it. This is the story of Roy Hassel and the junkyard that saved a county. Harden County sits in the heart of central Iowa. Rich, flat black soil that grows corn and soybeans the way other places grow weeds. In 1966, the county had about 600 active farms, 2 grain elevators, a feed mill, a bank, a co-op, and a John Deere dealership in Eldora run by a man named Merle Gustafson, who believed that the only good equipment was new equipment, and the only good farmer was the one writing the check. Roy Hassel was 53 years old and had farmed 240 acres on the east side of the county since 1937, the year he took over from his father, who'd taken over from his father, who'd homesteaded the land in 1879. 3 generations of Hassels on the same ground, 240 acres. Never more, never less. The farm had one unusual feature, a ravine, a deep, steep-sided gully that ran for about 300 yards along the north boundary of the property, carved by a creek that had long since changed course. The ravine was maybe 40 feet wide and 20 feet deep, too steep to plant, too rocky to graze, too irregular to do anything useful with. It was, by any farmer's estimation, wasted ground. Roy's father had used it as a dump. When a piece of equipment died, it went into the ravine. By the time Roy took over the farm, there were already a dozen pieces of machinery down there. A horse-drawn cultivator from the 1910s, 2 Farmall regular tractors from the 30s, a thrashing machine frame, various plows and harrows. Iron ghosts of his father's farming life. Most men would have called the scrap dealer and cleared it out. Roy did the opposite. He started adding to it. Not randomly, not carelessly. Roy Hassel had a system. It started in 1966 with a neighbor named Carl Hinton who bought a new John Deere 420 and wanted to get rid of his old Farmall 460. The 460 had a cracked block, unusable as a tractor. Carl was going to pay the scrap man to haul it away. "Don't scrap it," Roy said. "Bring it to my place, I'll take it." Carl looked at him like he'd offered to adopt a dead cat. "Roy, that tractor's junk. The block's cracked. It's not worth fixing." "I don't want to fix it. I want the parts. The hydraulic pump is good. The PTO shaft is good. The rear end is good. The gauges, the seat, the steering column, the fuel injector, the water pump, all good. One cracked block doesn't make a tractor worthless. It makes 90% of the tractor worth saving." Carl shrugged. Hauling the Farmall to Roy's ravine was easier than waiting for the scrap man. He delivered it the next Saturday. Roy spent that weekend taking the 460 apart, not smashing it with a sledgehammer, disassembling it carefully with wrenches and a shop manual. He pulled every salvageable part, cleaned it, labeled it with a grease pencil on a strip of masking tape. Make, model, part name, condition, and stored it in his barn. The hydraulic pump went on a shelf. The PTO shaft hung on a wall hook. The fuel injector went in a coffee can labeled IH 460 injectors. The water pump went in a box labeled IH Water Pumps 300 460 series. The empty carcass went into the ravine, organized. Frame on one side, sheet metal stacked flat, block standing upright next to two other blocks from his father's tractors. And that was how it started. Word spread not through any effort by Roy. He wasn't the kind of man who advertised. It spread the way everything spreads in farm country. One neighbor told another who mentioned it at the co-op. Roy Hassel's taking dead equipment. Anything you don't want, bring it to him. He's got a ravine. Within 2 years, farmers from across the township were bringing their broken, obsolete, worn-out machinery to Roy's farm. A combine header with bent teeth, a grain drill with a seized gearbox, a manure spreader with a rotted floor, 2 more tractors, a Farmall H with a blown head gasket and an Oliver 70 with a cracked manifold, a hay baler that had been sitting behind a barn for 12 years, 3 plows with broken shares. Roy took everything. He said yes to every piece that arrived, and he spent his evenings and weekends in his barn, disassembling, cleaning, labeling, and storing. By 1970, Roy's barn had 412 parts on its shelves, hooks, and floor racks. He knew this because he kept a ledger, a spiral notebook with lined pages where he recorded every part by date of acquisition, source, machine, condition, and location in the barn. 412 parts organized by brand, model, and function, cross-referenced in a notebook that Roy updated every time he added or removed a piece. His wife, Della, thought he'd lost his mind. "Roy," she said one evening, watching him label a set of Farmall brake shoes with strips of masking tape, "we have a barn full of tractor parts and a ravine full of dead machines. The neighbors already call this place the junkyard. When are you going to stop?" "When I run out of room. The ravine is getting full. Then I'll start another row." Now let me tell you how the county reacted, because the reaction is half the story. Merle Gustafson, the John Deere dealer in Eldora, was the first to make it personal. Merle was a salesman to his core. He believed that the American farmer's job was to buy equipment, and the American dealer's job was to sell it. Every used part that Roy pulled from a dead tractor was a new part that Merle didn't sell. Every farmer who drove to Roy's barn instead of Merle's showroom was a customer lost. Merle didn't say this directly. He said it the way small-town businessmen say things, sideways at the co-op, loud enough for the right ears. "Roy Hassel's running a junkyard out there," Merle told the Saturday morning crowd at the co-op counter. "I drove past yesterday and counted 14 dead tractors, 6 combines, and what looked like the entire undercarriage of a 40-year-old thrashing machine. It's an eyesore. It's a safety hazard. And it's bad for every equipment dealer in the county because every farmer who puts a used hydraulic pump on his tractor instead of buying new is a farmer who's cheating the system." The co-op crowd murmured. Some nodded. A few defended Roy quietly. "He's not hurting anyone, Merle," but most stayed silent. Nobody wanted to cross the JD dealer. Merle controlled the service department, and every farmer in the county needed his service department at least twice a year. The county got involved in 1973. A complaint was filed anonymously, though everyone assumed it came from Merle's direction, about an unlicensed salvage operation on Roy's property. The county zoning officer, a man named Dale Lundquist, drove out to inspect. Dale stood at the edge of the ravine and looked down at what was, by that point, approximately 30 pieces of dead equipment arranged in loose rows, plus the growing inventory in the barn. "Roy," Dale said, "I've got a complaint that you're running a commercial salvage yard without a permit." "I'm not running a commercial anything," Roy said. "I'm a farmer with a ravine full of equipment that other farmers gave me. I don't buy it. I don't advertise it. If someone needs a part and I've got it, I give it to them or trade for something I need. That's not commerce. That's neighborly." Dale looked at the ravine, looked at Roy, looked at the barn with its organized shelves visible through the open door. "You've got more parts in that barn than most dealers." "I've got more parts than Merle Gustafson, that's for sure, but Merle charges 300% markup. I charge nothing. Dale wrote something on his clipboard, nodded, and drove away. The complaint was filed as no violation found. The junkyard stayed, but the name stuck. Roy Hassel was the junkyard farmer. His ravine was the junkyard. His barn was the junk shop. When people gave directions past Roy's place, they said turn left at the junkyard. Roy never objected. He never defended himself. He just kept collecting, disassembling, labeling, and storing. By 1978, his notebook listed 1,847 parts. The ravine held over 50 pieces of dead equipment. The barn was full, so Roy had built a second storage shed. He'd also started specializing. He noticed that international harvester parts, Farmall tractors, IH combines, IH implements, were the most requested because IH equipment was the most common in central Iowa. So he began actively seeking out dead IH machines. When he heard about a farmer scrapping a Farmall, Roy was the first call. By 1980, Roy's collection included parts for every major Farmall model from the 1940s through the 70s. The H, M, Super M, 300, 400, 460, 560, 650, 706, 806, 1066. He had John Deere parts too, and Oliver and Allie's Chalmers and Massey Ferguson, but Farmall was his specialty. Farmall was his library. And nobody cared. Because in 1980, you could still drive to Merle Gustafson's dealership in Eldora and buy a new fuel injector for a Farmall 706 for $68. Why would you drive to Roy's barn and dig through a coffee can when you could get a new part from Merle? The answer arrived in 1982, and it arrived with the force of a tornado. You know the story, the farm crisis. Interest rates hit 21.5%. Corn prices collapsed. Land values dropped 60%. Debt that had seemed manageable at 9% interest became catastrophic at 20%. Between 1982 and 1987, 300,000 American farms defaulted on their loans. But there's a piece of the farm crisis that doesn't get told enough. The part about parts. When the crisis hit, the first thing farmers stopped buying was new equipment. Tractor sales in Iowa dropped 40% between 1980 and 1983. Combine sales dropped 55%. The farmers who were surviving, the ones who hadn't been foreclosed on yet, were doing it by stretching every piece of equipment they had as far as it would go. As one Iowa farmer told a reporter in 1984, "All our tractors are getting a lot of age on them, but we'll keep them a few more years. You can put a lot of repairs into a machine for what it costs to buy." That sentence describes exactly what Roy Hassel had been preparing for since 1966. Because when farmers stop buying new equipment, they start fixing old equipment. And when they start fixing old equipment, they need parts. Merle Gustafson's dealership was dying. New tractor sales went from 22 units in 1979 to 4 in 1983 to 0 in 1985. 0. Not a single new tractor sold in Harden County in 1985. In August of 1985, Merle Gustafson closed the John Deere dealership. 28 years in business. Gone. The showroom was empty. The service bay was padlocked. The parts counter where Merle had stood and mocked Roy Hassel's junkyard for 15 years was bare. And suddenly, every farmer in Harden County who needed a part for a tractor that was 10, 15, 20 years old had nowhere to go. The nearest remaining dealer was in Marshalltown, 45 minutes each way, and even Marshalltown didn't stock parts for older models. You know where they went instead. The first farmer showed up at Roy's barn on a Tuesday morning in September of 1985. Gene Brewer. His Farmall 706 had a failed fuel injector. Gene needed the tractor running for harvest. Harvest was 2 weeks away. Roy, Gene said, standing in the barn doorway, hat in his hands, looking at the shelves of labeled parts. "I need a fuel injector for a 706. Merle is closed. Marshalltown doesn't have one. They said 4 to 6 weeks on order. Roy walked to the back of the barn, second shelf, third row. He reached into a coffee can labeled IH706 injectors and pulled out two. Both clean, both tested, both ready. "Take your pick," Roy said. "How much?" "How much you got?" "Not much." "Then it's not much." Gene Brewer paid Roy $12 for a fuel injector that would have cost $68 new. He drove home, installed it in an hour, and his 706 was running by suppertime. That was Tuesday. By Friday, 3 more farmers had come to Roy's barn. By the end of September, 11. By Christmas of 1985, Roy Hassel had supplied parts to 37 farmers across Harden County and 2 neighboring counties. Fuel injectors, hydraulic pumps, PTO shafts, water pumps, alternators, starter motors, brake shoes, steering cylinders, gauge clusters, exhaust manifolds. Parts that were unavailable at any dealer within 100 miles, pulled from machines that had been sitting in Roy's Ravine for years, cleaned and tested in Roy's barn, and sold for whatever the farmer could afford. Roy's ledger for 1985 shows 142 parts distributed, 63 Farmall, 31 John Deere, 22 Oliver, 14 Allis Chalmers, 12 Massey Ferguson. Total income from parts sales that year, $4,800. Average price per part, $33.80. The same parts new would have cost an average of $150 each. Roy was saving farmers 70%. And he was the only source for many of the parts, because the manufacturers had stopped producing them years ago. Roy wasn't getting rich, but the parts income covered his property taxes and then some, which was more than a lot of his neighbors could say in 1985. What Roy was getting was something more valuable than money. He was getting proven right. Let me tell you about the moment it became personal. In March of 1986, a pickup truck pulled into Roy's driveway that Roy recognized but never expected to see there. A blue Ford with the faded outline of a logo on the door, a logo that had been peeled off but left a ghost. The logo said Gustafson Implement, John Deere Sales and Service. Merle Gustafson got out of the truck. Roy was in the barn rebuilding a water pump for a Farmall 560. He looked up, saw Merle, and set down his wrench. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The fact that Merle Gustafson was standing in the barn he'd mocked for 20 years said everything. Merle looked around at the shelves, at the labeled parts, at the coffee cans and cardboard boxes, each one marked with a make, model, and part name, at the cleanliness and the organization, and the system that Roy had spent 2 decades building, while Merle had spent 2 decades laughing at it. "I need a steering cylinder for a 4020, Merle said quietly. He was farming his own ground now. He kept a John Deere 4020 for his own use. The steering cylinder had blown, and the nearest dealer who stocked the part was in Des Moines, and even Des Moines wanted $185 for it. And Merle Gustafson, the man who'd sold parts at 300% markup for 28 years, couldn't afford $185 for a steering cylinder. Roy didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He walked to the second shed, pulled a tarp off a shelf, and produced a steering cylinder for a John Deere 4020. Clean, tested, ready. "How much?" Merle asked. $20. Merle reached for his wallet. His hands were shaking, not from cold. It was March in Iowa, but it wasn't that cold. His hands were shaking because he was buying a used part from the man he'd called the junkyard farmer, in the barn he'd called an eyesore, on the farm he'd tried to get the county to shut down. Roy took the $20 bill, folded it, and put it in his front pocket. "Merle," Roy said, "I want you to know something. I never collected this stuff to prove you wrong. I collected it because I knew, the same way I know what the weather's going to do when the wind shifts, that someday someone would need what everyone else threw away. I didn't know when, I didn't know who, but I knew it would happen." He paused. The thing about junk is that it's only junk until you need it. Then it's the most valuable thing in the room. Merle didn't say anything. He took the steering cylinder, put it in his truck, and drove away. Roy went back to rebuilding the water pump. They never discussed it again. But Merle never called Roy's farm a junkyard again. And when someone at the co-op used the word, "Old habits die hard in farm country," Merle would go quiet and look at his coffee and say nothing. The crisis didn't end in 1986. It got worse before it got better, and Roy's barn got busier. From 1986 through 1988, Roy distributed over 200 parts a year. Farmers drove from 3 counties away. Some came with specific part numbers written on scraps of paper. Some came with the broken part in hand, hoping Roy had a match. Some came with nothing but a description. It's the thing on the left side of the engine that connects to the thing that goes to the hydraulics. And Roy, who had memorized his inventory the way a librarian memorizes a collection, would nod, walk to a specific shelf, and produce the exact part. He never turned anyone away. If a farmer couldn't pay, Roy traded labor for parts, grain for parts, fence work for parts. One farmer paid for a complete set of brake shoes for a Farmall 806 with 3 laying hens. Roy accepted. DeLau was happy about the hens at least. By 1990, Roy's operation had grown beyond what he'd imagined. The barn held over 3,000 cataloged parts. The second shed held another 1,500. The Ravine held 78 equipment carcasses arranged in rows by manufacturer. Farmall on the north side, John Deere on the south, everything else in the middle. The notebook had been replaced by a set of notebooks, 12 volumes, cross-indexed, covering every part Roy had acquired, distributed, or still held. His son Dennis had joined the operation in 1987, the same year he graduated from high school. Dennis had grown up sorting parts the way other boys sorted baseball cards. He knew the difference between a Farmall 560 hydraulic pump and a 706 pump by feel. The weight, the fitting size, the shape of the housing. He was 19 years old and could identify more tractor parts by touch than most mechanics could by looking. Together, Roy and Dennis turned the junkyard into something the county had never seen. A salvage operation that ran on knowledge instead of money. They didn't have a computer. They didn't have a storefront. They didn't even have a phone listing until 1992 when DeLau finally insisted they put an ad in the county directory. Hassel Farm Equipment Salvage, used parts for all makes, fair prices. That ad generated more calls than Roy expected, and not just from farmers. A tractor collector in Minnesota called looking for a dashboard cluster for a 1949 Farmall M. Roy had too. An agricultural museum in Nebraska needed a PTO assembly for a display tractor. Roy shipped one free of charge. Roy Hassel died in 2003 at the age of 90. He'd farmed 240 acres for 66 years and collected salvage equipment for 37 of them. He'd never borrowed money for equipment. He'd never bought a new tractor. He'd driven a succession of used Farmalls, each one assembled partly from parts he'd pulled from machines in the Ravine. Dennis took over the farm and the salvage operation. By 2003, the inventory had grown to over 6,000 cataloged parts. The Ravine held nearly 100 equipment carcasses. The operation was known across central Iowa, not as a junkyard anymore, as a salvage yard, a parts source, a place where farmers went when nobody else could help. In 2008, the Des Moines Register ran a feature story about Dennis and the salvage yard. The headline read, "The Farm That Saves Farms." How one Iowa family's junkyard became the Midwest's last resort for tractor parts. The reporter asked Dennis what his father would have thought about the article. He'd have thought it was a waste of newspaper ink, Dennis said. He didn't collect parts for attention. He collected them because he couldn't stand watching good iron go to waste. Every piece of metal that went to the scrap man was a piece of metal that some farmer someday was going to wish he had. Dad just made sure it was here when they needed it. The reporter asked one more question. What's the most valuable thing in the barn? Dennis thought about it, then he walked to the original shelf. Shelf 1, row 1. The first shelf Roy had organized in 1966. He reached up and pulled down a coffee can labeled IH 460 injectors. The first can Roy had ever labeled, from the first tractor he'd ever salvaged, Carl Hinton's Farmall 460 with the cracked block. That can still had one injector in it, the last one. This, Dennis said, holding it up, not because of what it's worth, because it's where it all started. One man looked at a dead tractor and saw parts instead of junk. That's the whole story. The salvage yard is still running. Dennis's son Kyle, the third generation, joined in 2016. The ravine is full. The barn is full. The second shed is full. They've built a third building. The notebooks have been transferred to a computer, but Dennis keeps the originals in a fireproof cabinet in the farmhouse. 12 volumes of Roy's handwriting. A complete record of 37 years of saving what everyone else threw away. And every week, a farmer drives up the lane, parks beside the ravine that everyone used to call the junkyard, walks into the barn, and asks for a part that nobody else in the state of Iowa can provide. The answer is almost always yes, because Roy Hassel spent 20 years collecting what everyone laughed at, 20 years being called the junkyard farmer, 20 years filling coffee cans with parts that had no value until the day they had all the value in the world. The dealer laughed, the county complained, the neighbors shook their heads. But the barn is still full, the parts are still labeled, and the farmers are still coming. That's what happens when a man sees treasure where everyone else sees trash.